Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Jim Marion and I'm your instructor for this course, Project Management. I love project management. I've used it throughout my career and I hope by the end of this course you will too. I'm really looking forward to working with you this term and I'm really especially looking forward to visiting Vietnam again. It's been a few years. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a beautiful country and wonderful people. So I look forward to working with you and helping you understand this field. Now, before we jump into the lecture, let me say project management can appear to be a little bit confusing at first. There's so many different processes. There's so many things to remember, apparently anyway. Well, I'm going to do my best to keep it simple, to help you understand it, so you can actually use it in your career. So let's get started with the introductory lecture to help prepare you to learn more about project management. Here we go. All right, first of all, this is me looking at my best in this picture, but this course is MBAV6961 Project Management, and I'm happy to welcome you aboard today. So let's take a look at what we're going to learn in today's lecture. Today, I'm going to give you an introduction to project management and also some highlights from the text in chapters 1 through 5. Now, there are two other video lectures that I'll present before I arrive in Vietnam. Plus, keep in mind when I actually get there, we're going to go into much more detail and work out a lot more in-depth practice problems. So if you feel a little lost, you have a local tutor. I will also be there to help, so don't worry about it too much, especially in this very first lecture where we're discussing more introductory materials. So we'll go 1 through 5. Tonight, along with other introductory information, and then as we progress through the course, we are going to go through the remaining chapters in these lectures, and then when I'm there, we'll go through each in detail to prepare you for your final exam. So let's get started. All right, first of all, let's take a look at a historical perspective of project management. Okay, if you go back to the 1960s, this is where classical project management came to be. This is network diagrams and something called CPM, or critical path method, or PERT. Now, when you hear these two terms, CPM or PERT, keep in mind that even though this may seem complicated, really what you're doing is thinking about how you can put different activities in a logical sequence. For example, when I come to Vietnam, due to the time change, I'm sure in the morning I will want some coffee. If you make coffee, there is a certain sequence of events you must carry out. You have to boil water. You have to put in coffee in the coffee pot. You need to put in a coffee filter. You must do one after the other, and you cannot brew the coffee until you've done these things. That's what a network diagram, such as the critical path method and the program evaluation and review technique, or PERT method, does for you. It gives you a tool for putting activities in a logical sequence so you can see how long it's going to take to do something. For example, in the coffee example I gave you, you could list all the activities required to make coffee, and then in the end, you can figure out how long it takes to brew a pot of coffee once you've considered all the steps in sequence. In the 70s, we have something called the triple constraint. Now, the triple constraint has to do with three major things in project management. That is the schedule or time, the budget or cost, and then we also have scope. Scope relates to what it is you're going to be making. So what am I going to make? What am I going to produce or deliver? How long is it going to take to do that? And how much does it cost? That's the triple constraint. And it's called constraints because you can never do all three in an optimal way. And what do I mean by optimal way? Well, if I pay more money, I may be able to receive something faster. If I don't want to spend as much money, I may have to reduce the features that I'm requesting or take more time to do it. That's why they're called constraints. You can have any two, but not all three. In the 80s, there was discussion about multiple projects being managed at once. Large companies did this. And then in the 90s and beyond, we have the idea of integration. which really involves larger companies managing a number of projects together at the same time and making sure every project that was done linked up well with company strategy. Okay? Now, that's modern history, but we can say that ancient history relates to project management as well. Consider the Great Wall of China or the Great Pyramids. All of them had many, many workers involved, some level of coordination, and what was built in these two examples are examples of projects. You produced something that was unique. It was an effort that had a beginning and an ending. It was complex. It used resources. These are elements of a project, as we will learn. But it was a very early project and maybe not as systematic as some projects that are done today. But notice what we do have in common with ancient history. Well, coordination and schedule maintenance. For example, if it's true that the pyramids are tombs for the pharaoh, you did have an all-important deadline to get it done before the pharaoh died, for example. But we don't see a lot of evidence of optimization of schedules. Now, in the late 19th century, this would be the late 1800s, we see a growing complexity of commerce throughout the world. Now, this also is referring to the United States when we consider the Transcontinental Railroad. This was a major project to have the first railroad from coast to coast in the U.S. in 1862. This was after the Pacific Railroad Act. There was authorization to build a railway and a telegraph line, and there was funding granted. And it was very much managed as a project. In fact, there is some evidence of some of the project materials left over. For example, if we see the early years of the Transcontinental Railroad, we see salaries for the different people working on for running the lines, maybe for making observations, for sketching the land, for leveling. They even had salaries for hunters, people who would collect food for the workers. So, just like a modern project, there were many people involved, which in modern project management we consider these resources, and they were paid, and this had to be tracked as part of the overall cost of this project. All right, now we have increasing organization required and organizing labor to mass produce goods, such as the automobile. But the automobile, this is an example of an assembly line, which is an ongoing operation rather than a project. However, a project was required to develop each new automobile product that was brought to market. And if there was a certain amount of customizing used in each car, then that would be a project. Remember, a project is different from an ongoing operation in that it has a beginning and an end. It's unique, it produces deliverables, it's complex, it uses resources. So we see an example of an assembly line, but that's an ongoing operation. But why do we keep this in mind when we discuss the evolution of project management? It's because many of the principles used in organizing labor at a mass scale, these principles were adopted by project management, and I will show you that. For example, let's take a look at Henry Gantt. You may have heard of the Gantt chart. This is a means for identifying key milestones and activity durations. It's a way to keep track of the project schedule and to communicate that project schedule to all of the people involved in the project. And as we will see, the people involved in the project are known as stakeholders. You will hear the term stakeholders used in project management. And the stakeholder term is different from stockholders or owners of the company. A stakeholder is someone who has an interest in the outcome of the project or is involved in some way, and project managers and project teams have to keep stakeholders in mind. And the Gantt chart is one way to communicate to such stakeholders, and we'll see how shortly. This is an example of a simple Gantt chart. You see basic project tasks, you see durations of each task, you see the months of the year. This is dated from 1918, but it's an example of what Henry Gantt invented. And this was used in project management, but back in the day, it was also used for operations management, how long it would take to develop something or maybe to produce something. It was simply a communication tool that we use today for communicating duration and milestones. Here's an example of the Gantt chart used to illustrate the progress to plan. So the standard Gantt chart shows the durations and when something is supposed to finish, which would be the milestone, the major event for which the project is trying to achieve. But these red lines show you what you have already done. So for example, project XYZ is ahead of schedule. Right? The prototype production is ahead of schedule, development is on schedule. Red showing the amount of progress you have made on your plan. Okay, these little triangles that you see are examples of milestones. They're really events. It's not really something you do, it's something you wait and watch for. For example, if you're going to produce something by a certain time, that time, for example, research would be, it looks like end of March. That is a milestone. You will target the end of March, just like we will target August 6th for the end of this class, for example. That's a milestone that you will look forward to. Or the last class, here's an example of a milestone, the last day of the last class in your MBA program. I'm sure that's a milestone you will be looking forward to achieving. It's not an activity, it has no duration, but it's an event that is a target for your project. Okay, and that's all communicated on a Gantt chart. Here's a more complicated Gantt chart that's more typical of what you see in industry. And remember, this came out of early operations management in the early 1900s, which would be the early dates of the 20th century. You see durations, you see milestones, you see who is responsible. It can be used in operations management, and those principles are adopted in project management as a communication tool. Next, we see something that came out of a field known as scientific management. I don't know if you're familiar with scientific management, but in the early 1900s in an assembly line, for example, Henry Ford's assembly line, and maybe those of you who are working in a manufacturing environment are aware that every activity that's completed on an assembly line, you have to measure the standard time. How long does it take to perform certain activities? Or you may take a larger deliverable and break it down into smaller pieces, each with standard times. That's an example of scientific management. Frederic Taylor was one of the founders of scientific management, but the idea of breaking down larger components of work into smaller pieces that could be easily executed, that is part of scientific management. And again, it was originally used for operation management, but now it's used for project management quite a bit, quite often. In fact, every project that you start, you must clarify the scope of that project. Remember, scope is what your project will deliver. Okay, so projects can be very large, so you have to identify all of the pieces required to produce that large final deliverable. And that's what the work breakdown structure does. It is an elaboration of the scope, or to put it more simply, it is a detailed outline of exactly what your project will deliver. This is an example of a project to produce a mountain bike. Notice a mountain bike has wheel systems, gearing systems, frame systems. These are all of the components of that bike. So one of the first elements you will complete in building a project plan is to clarify the scope of that project plan, to break down the pieces of what you will deliver. And then after you decide what it is in detail that you will deliver, which is the project scope, at that point you will consider what activities are required to produce those deliverables. And that is what you include in the project schedule. Okay, here is an example of Frederic Taylor's principles of scientific management, and that's what gave us the work breakdown structure in project management. Before 1950s, you had ad hoc project management. Now, ad hoc is a Latin term. This means something that's done as needed. It's a one-off. You don't have any specified plan or template you follow. You just do what comes naturally. It's not systematic. It's not process-driven. Mature companies today, those that are most respected, operate using process management, and they enforce process discipline. Nothing is done ad hoc. It's all planned before it's executed. But before the 1950s, most project work was ad hoc. And then again, you began to see Gantt charts and other informal techniques, and in the early 50s, you began to see modern project management. And much of this project management came out of defense projects that were very highly technical, very large, very complex. Okay, now I mentioned two different methods for analyzing the sequence of activities required to produce a project or to produce a deliverable. Remember, I said CPM, which stands for Critical Path Method, and then there is PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. We will learn both of these in this course, but just remember, CPM assumes that the duration of every activity is known. You know exactly how long it takes to do each activity, therefore you assign the durations to each activity, put the activities in logical sequence, and then you know the total project as a result. But the PERT method, the Program Evaluation and Review Technique, assumes you do not know exactly how long it's going to take for each activity. Therefore, the duration of each activity is created using an estimate, typically a 3-point estimation system, and it uses statistical methods. Okay, so that's the difference between CPM and PERT. CPM assumes you know how long each task is going to take. PERT assumes you do not, and so you use 3-point estimates and you create a weighted average of this. Okay, but in both methods, you list all of the activities, you understand the dependencies between activities for each. Now, when I say dependencies, remember the example of brewing coffee. You cannot start brewing coffee until you've added coffee and added water to the pot. If you try brewing coffee before you add water and coffee, it's not going to work. Therefore, coffee brewing is dependent upon water and coffee being added to the pot. Those are dependencies. Furthermore, there's another way to say it. Water and coffee grounds going into the pot are said to be predecessors of coffee brewing. And coffee brewing is a successor to adding coffee and water. Predecessors, that's a word that means that which comes before, precedes, it comes from the word precede, predecessor, things that come before. Successor means things that come after. You took a class in your MBA program before this class. That class was a predecessor to this one, and this class is a successor to that previous class. Okay, but that's what both CPM and PERT do. You list all activities, you put them in logical order, and you afterwards, based on the dependencies, the logical relationships between each, for example, the coffee example, you can understand how long it takes for the overall project. Okay, so in recent history, 80s and 90s, you see a lot of development on risk management techniques, communication, leadership, and especially with software projects. Why software projects and why so much emphasis? Because software projects are very hard. Everything you do is invisible. You're writing code and you're putting pieces of code together and no one can see it. And it's rarely clear how it's going to come together. And it's always easy to miss something. So you need lots of communication, lots of motivated people. You need good leadership. You need good risk management. And not every project has software or is exclusively software, but there's a lot of software involved in most projects today, in very complex projects. So this is why there's so much emphasis on techniques that came out of software development. Okay, so what's happening today in terms of trends? Increasing scope. What this means is project management is being used for more than just technical projects. For example, companies who need to update their strategy can use project management. You can use project management to develop your strategy. Also, let's say you have a strategic initiative, for example, increasing sales next year by 10%. You may charter a project to work toward that. For example, by hiring new salespeople or creating a new marketing campaign. All of these activities could be managed using project management, and CEOs of companies are increasingly understanding that project management has a wider application than just technical projects. It's really a set of business processes for getting work done. You will also hear a term quite often called portfolio management. Portfolio management is a very big word that means something very simple. Portfolio, think of that term, and you may have heard that term in the context of investments. The reason this term is used is because companies spend money on projects. They invest in projects. So companies view all of the projects that they are working on today, they view each of these as part of their portfolio or part of the set of investments. Okay? So this is why it's thought of as portfolio. But when you think of project portfolio management, all you are doing is determining what it is you're going to work on and what it is you're not going to work on. Which project has the best opportunity for a big payoff and which should be set aside for later. That's portfolio management, making sure that everything that a company spends its resources on, it had better pay, it better have a best chance of being successful. There are many other aspects to portfolio management and companies that manage their work via projects. What kind of culture are you going to have and how you're going to maintain it? How about information technology projects? They're much higher in complexity typically. How are you going to approach managing risk? These are all things to consider. So that's a little bit about the history of project management and some of the basic concepts of project management to get you started. So with that, let's dive into something referred to as the PMBOK. PMBOK is a funny word. It's funny even in English, but it stands for the Project Management Body of Knowledge. What is the Project Management Body of Knowledge? Well, let's take a look at that. The core concepts that are addressed initially are: what is a project? How does project management relate to other disciplines? And something called the life cycle. So all four of these I could discuss at once by saying projects are unique, they're complex, they use resources, they have a definitive beginning and an ending, and that's one of the aspects of project management that sets it apart from operations management. Operations versus project kind of reminds me of analog versus digital. Analog is continuous, digital is discrete. So operations go on and on forever as CEOs and the members of their company seek to achieve the company's mission, vision, values over an extended period of time and satisfy the customer and produce returns for shareholders. That's a very long-term time horizon. Projects are not continuous like that. They start and they finish. When do they finish? Once they produce deliverables. And the reason why project management is used more often is because much of the work that happens in ongoing operations could be managed as a project. Okay, so we'll take a look at the formal definition of projects and see how specifically they relate to other disciplines. Okay, so the formal definitions: it's complex, it's one time. Notice the three areas here: budget, schedule, and resources. That's the triple constraint. You have a clear goal or a clear set of goals. For example, you could not have a project with the goal of, let's make everyone happy. That's a very fuzzy, unclear goal. How would you even define that? How would you know if you're successful? How do you know when you're finished? So the goal has to be clear. And you will often hear a term called SMART goals. Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-bound. So make your goals clear, because if you don't, you won't know once you've finished. And they're customer-focused. But as the guide to the project management body of knowledge says, it's a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a new, unique product, service, or result. Okay, so notice the word result, which means that a project could produce something intangible. You could develop a process or a set of guidelines or a piece of software. Okay, Projects are ad hoc endeavors with a clear life cycle. Now, life cycle means it has a beginning and an end, just like humans have a life cycle. Humans are born, they grow older, they become mature adults, they age, just like I'm aging. They lose their hair, for example, and then eventually they die. That's what all humans do. Well, that's what all projects do. They start, they mature, they produce their deliverables, and they finish. The projects could be seen as building blocks on the execution of strategy. Remember I told you, well, if you had a strategy about increasing sales, you could charter a project to help do that. You can improve projects. You can manage change, like put in new systems, processes, like an enterprise resource planning system. Project management is cross-functional. You may hear the term cross-functional. You may have heard that before. Well, a traditional organization has multiple functions like manufacturing, engineering, service, finance, information technology. A project uses people from each of those functions. Therefore, it cuts across all functions, which is why it's referred to as cross-functional, or it's crossing functional boundaries. Okay? It has management functions like planning and organizing. Focuses on customer requirements, and it focuses on clear objectives. Now, there's a lot said in this second line here, customer requirements. You can't just ask a customer, what is it you want? Because sometimes the customer, him or herself, doesn't fully know what's needed. It requires a lot of discussion, sometimes negotiation, to thoroughly understand the requirements of a client. Okay? So when we compare and contrast projects versus processes, a process is repeating. It may have multiple objectives. It's ongoing. They're homogeneous. For example, let's say you go to the bank and you see people working at a bank. Every day they take deposits, they hand out money, they update the books, they type things into computers. That's an ongoing operation. However, let's say you were responsible for a project that produced some financial software to deliver to a bank. That's very different from routine work, something that a bank teller might do, and that's an example of a project. So if we compare and contrast, projects have greater certainty, part of the line or functional organization. A project, though, may develop a new process or product, one objective. It has a limited life. Heterogeneous. Okay, heterogeneous meaning versus homogeneous. Homogeneous means everything looks the same. Heterogeneous means it's always different. In a project, it's always something new. And every project is unique. So naturally, they're going to be heterogeneous. Greater uncertainty outside the line organization. It could upset the status quo. So it's typical that projects operate outside the normal traditional functional organization, which is why they require special approval in the form of a charter. Okay, one thing to consider, and this is why you may consider being a project manager, because projects tend to fail quite often. And when I say fail, that means they're either late, or they're over budget, or they don't produce everything they originally promised. Okay, and half of IT projects become runaways. I joined a project late in an attempt to try and recover a project, but it was a runaway in that there were more and more problems that were developing over time, and they were just not able to fix it. So it became indeterminate when they could actually deliver, if ever. And so eventually the project was shut down. Okay, that's a runaway project when you get more bugs every day, and every time you fix something or try to repair a defect, it creates more bugs. That's an example of a runaway project. So this is why we need you as project managers, because they fail so often. Okay, so projects fail often, and this is why we need project managers. In fact, I would consider one analogy I often make is project managers are like airplane pilots. The planes, airlines tend to work well. They've got a good success rate, but something's going to happen. A thunderstorm, a crosswind, running out of fuel. That's why we need a pilot there, is a risk management for the flight. That's what project managers are for, to address the risks that are naturally going to be faced in a project and address it. Okay, so why are projects so important? Shortened life cycles, for one thing. Notice every year, a couple of times a year, there's a new cell phone made available. Apple offers a couple of products a year. So does Samsung. So does Haier, Lenovo, Huawei. There's so many different products, and they're produced multiple times a year. An ongoing operation can't respond at that rate. Narrow product launch windows. This is something I faced when developing products, consumer electronics products. You must get that product done no later than September of that year if you want it available for holiday season sales. If you miss that, then you've missed it completely, and your project may totally fail. It may never pay off. Okay, products are getting more and more complicated. There's global markets. In fact, speaking of global markets, last week I was at a conference in Poland. And what did I see on a big billboard? I saw an advertisement for the latest Johnny Depp Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And that hasn't even launched in the U.S., or maybe it just has recently, but it's clear that this was an effort. Making a movie, for example, is a project, and they launched it throughout the world all at the same time. I thought that was very interesting. We're also in an economic period by low inflation. And what's the importance of low inflation? If inflation is low, probably interest rates are also low, and it's easier to justify projects that may have some risk. So maybe you'll take on more risk and therefore do more projects. Okay, here's an example of a typical project life cycle. Remember earlier I mentioned the life cycle of a human is from birth to maturity, to middle age, to old age and death eventually. So you see likewise in a project, you conceptualize it, meaning you have the idea for the project, then you plan it, then you actually do it, you deliver it, you finish it with project termination. So this is what a life cycle looks like. Okay, this is an explanation of what I just said at a high level. Conceptualization. Now I mentioned stakeholders. Remember I told you it's important to ask many details when you're talking to stakeholders about what do they need, trying to understand their requirements. That's where they come in the conceptualization process. You identify who's involved, who has an interest in this project, what their needs are, and try to understand their underlying needs so you can address them. Again, execution is actually doing the work, and termination is when you finish. Okay? Now this is a little bit different to see. Sorry this slide didn't come out well. This is changes during the project life cycle. You have the client interest, project stakeholders, resources, creativity, uncertainty. Let's go to this next slide to show what this means. This is really, this is a better way to see it, I think. Sorry that one didn't show that well. This shows the intensity level of each of your major stakeholders. Okay, also let's go to the bottom right-hand corner. You see uncertainty. Uncertainty is high at the beginning of a project, but it's low at the end. That makes sense because you're finished at that point. Clients are very interested in the beginning. They're not so interested in the middle, but they're interested in the end because they want to know when are they going to receive what they asked for. Your creativity, you need a lot of it in the middle of the project to try and do the work. Project stakeholders get increasingly interested as the project progresses. So what's the point of this slide? The point is, throughout the project life cycle, there are different players and there are different issues that take more of your time and interest. So you have to be aware of where you are in the project life cycle and understand what stakeholders, including not only your client but also people who are working on the project, understand where they stand, what their needs are, what their interests are, and the nature of the work you're doing. So the life cycle helps guide you through this process. It helps you. It's really like, this is really kind of like a compass to help you understand where you are at any given time in a project. I mentioned the triple constraint being cost or budget, time or schedule, and performance or scope. This text refers to a different constraint, and that's the quadruple constraint. The budget, the client acceptance, the performance, and the time. Okay, now this is where it really gets challenging for a project manager. As you're approaching the end of the project, your number one goal is to get the client to accept what you have developed, and that is not an easy task. Especially, for example, I was designing years ago with Panasonic cell phones for AT&T Wireless in North America. And AT&T Wireless has lab tests, field tests, alpha users, beta users. They put you through one complex challenge after another, because once the phone is released to their nationwide network, they don't want any problems. So it's really a challenge, and almost at the very end, you're balancing budget and performance and time, and maybe you're also begging the client just to wrap this up. And sometimes they do, hopefully in due time. I want to take a moment here to talk about strategic management. What is strategic management? Strategic management, in its simplest terms, is ensuring that your organization is goal-oriented. You are trying to achieve something. You're trying to achieve sustained competitiveness over an extended period of time. Okay, that's the ultimate goal of an organization, to do better than your competitors and make profits, to be able to pay your employees, to pay your shareholders, to satisfy the client, and you want to do that over an extended period of time, and you want to think through carefully what you're doing and especially why you're doing it for the most competitive position. That's strategic management, and it involves all functions of the organization. This is mentioned in the course on project management is because projects are often used in strategic management, especially when you create a small cross-functional team that includes elements of each of the functions in your organizations. It's as if you've created a miniature company to do one specific thing, and often that one specific thing can be strategic initiative. Okay, so when you consider what projects you are doing, you should very carefully understand why you're doing it. Okay, for example, let's take a look at projects and how they are a reflection of strategy. For example, a construction project could be part of an operating initiative. For example, a new distribution strategy or new plant operations. A development of products for greater market penetration could be a strategy, and therefore you kick off a product development project. So as you look at this slide and you look at the text, you see on the left the strategies. That means what you're going to do and why you're going to do it in order to attain a sustained competitive advantage. And then the other side, you have you have projects. And those projects are designed to execute components of your strategy. So in this sense, projects reflect strategy because they are a critical means for implementing your strategy. I would also go so far to say is you could commission a project to help develop your strategy in the first place. Okay, when I see this in the text, it's called the TOES matrix. I often think of this as SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So I think of it in backward terms, but I could see why it's put the way it's put in our text. Typically, your strengths and weaknesses are what you have internally, and your opportunities and threats are external. Although there are opportunities that you can find external, and you can find internal, and you can find internal threats as well. Although those could be weaknesses. But typically, when you think of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you think strengths and weaknesses as internal to the company, opportunities and threats as external. Okay, and then you can think about how you are going to maximize or minimize. Basically, it's this. Like let's take the maxi strategy. Develop projects that use strengths to maximize opportunities. So this is a strategy that uses an internal strength to try and achieve an external opportunity. Okay. On the other hand, if you've got a threat and a weakness, you may commission a project that minimizes weaknesses and avoids threats. This is simply a way of thinking about strategy. And why do you need to think about strategy? because strategy, without an understanding of strategy, it will not be clear at all what projects you should be doing and why. Projects tend to unfold from the strategies that you have, and this is simply a table that gives you the idea of the type of strategies that might exist in a company. All right, in the beginning of a project, and we will see this more clearly, especially when I'm there and we can go through this in more detail and work out more specific examples. We analyze stakeholders, and typically when you identify stakeholders, you then analyze them to see who is most interested. Remember, a stakeholder is anyone who has an interest in the outcome of the project. You can find out who's most interested and who has more or less power. Okay, so very powerful stakeholders who are highly interested in your project are those you really need to pay attention to, and you may need to address in your communications plan. Okay? There's internal and external stakeholders. For example, your project team members can be a stakeholder. External stakeholders could be your client, suppliers, or whoever. When you're a project management, you're dealing with everyone. In fact, this is why this little chart here explains why project management is often a good training ground for general management. After all, just like a general manager, you're managing a cross-functional team. You are also dealing with multiple individuals within your team and throughout the company, and then even outside the company. Here you see it, the project team members, the accountant, the clients, functional managers. This is good training for someone who's going to manage the ongoing operation. Okay, now, remember I said portfolio management is really about deciding what your company is going to invest in. What projects are you going to do? Which are you going to decide not to do for reasons of your strategy? Some projects advance the company's strategy better than others. And you need to have a keen eye on what those are. Before you manage a project, you have to decide what projects you're going to do. That is what's involved in portfolio management, or you could refer to it as project screening. What are some ways you can do this? Well, as a project manager or an executive, you could have a checklist. And a checklist is just a list of things that are important to you that you should consider in your project. For example, I want this to address my largest customer, to satisfy my largest customer. I want these deliverables to maybe have $10 million in sales. I want it to have a certain amount of financial return. I want it to ship overseas. I want it to open up a new market opportunity for me. These are just different ways of thinking about, in a systematic way, what projects you're going to do and what you're not going to do. Okay, so a checklist, the thing about a checklist is you just maybe list from, maybe 5 or 10 things that are important to you, and then every project, you examine every project and say, does it do this? Yes. Does it do this? Yes. Does it do this? No. Okay, I reject it. But the problem with a checklist is all items are weighted equally. And maybe this is not the best way to do it, which is why you have other scoring models that assign a weight to a score. For example, you have certain criteria, and based on criteria, for example, market share, financial return, ability to satisfy your largest customer, you may have criteria, and some of those criteria could be weighted higher than others. So your overall score is in this sideways M here, that's sigma for summation. The score is really the sum of the weight multiplied times the score of each. And we'll do some of these when we review when we're together. This is a weighted scoring system, and the highest weight wins. There's also something called the analytical hierarchy process. Sometimes this is used in very complex projects. I haven't seen it used that extensively, but in reality, the AHP, the analytical hierarchy process, is kind of like a scoring model, but it's done in a little bit more structured fashion, so you can compare multiple projects more easily. Again, what's the point of all of these? The point of all of this is project screening. You're trying to decide what you should do and what you shouldn't do. So you've got your your simple scoring model. You can have a checklist with no weights, a weighted checklist, a weighted and highly structured checklist. Now we move on to something a little bit more complicated. And don't worry if this is a little bit scary at first. It will get easier with practice. And these are some financial models for deciding what projects you should and should not do. For example, the payback period. Okay, so the payback period just says you're answering the question, how long is this project going to take to reach a break-even point? For example, if I invest $100 today, when will I get my $100 back? Will it be a month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years? The longer a project takes to pay back, the more questionable the project is. The sooner you're going to pay back, the better. Now, one thing about the simple payback period is it does not take into account the time value of money. And the time value of money, the money you have in your hand today, is worth more than a promise of money tomorrow. Which would you rather have, $100 in your hand today or someone who promises you $100 tomorrow? Well, you want the money in hand today because if you had it, you could invest it and it could be producing investment returns. Also, someone who promises you money a year from now, there's some risk involved, especially if it's your brother-in-law who's promising you the money, right? So there's a risk factor involved. This is why the value of money changes over time. And we'll work some problems when we're together. But this says cash flows should be discounted. This means that this says that when you calculate the payback period, you should take into account the time value of money, which we won't do in this lecture due to interest of time, but I'll show you when we're together, and perhaps your tutor can show you some very simple ways of doing that. Okay? The net present value is a typical method of understanding the time value of money. Now, before we look at this formula, let me explain what the net present value is. All right, so given that money varies according to time, the value varies according to time. $100 today is worth more than the promise of $100 tomorrow. And the difference is if you had $100 today, you could be investing it. All right? So the net present value, it does this. In this formula, you take how much money you're going to invest in the project, how much money you expect to get back, and over what period you expect to get back, and what kind of interest rate or return rate could I be earning if I had that money in my hand today. Okay, and then once you put in those numbers, your cash outlay today, your estimated cash income in the future, plus the return rate, once you have plugged that in, the net present value formula does three things. It tells you, A, this has a positive net present value, which means this project will return more to you than if you put your money in a safe investment, such as a bank. A zero net present value means your project is worth the same as if you put money in the bank or a safe investment activity. And a negative NPV means you're better off putting your money in the bank because this project returns less than a safe investment. So how do project managers evaluate this? Here's how. By taking this formula, and by the way, what I said simply, you can see it mathematically. F is the cash flow for period T. That just means money the FT means that's money I'm expecting in the future. And underneath it, you have 1 plus the return rate plus any inflation. Okay, so for every period you're going to get cash, you're going to divide it by 1 plus the return rate plus any inflation, and that's known as the discount rate. And what's this IO? This IO is how much I'm spending today. So let's look at this in plain English. The net present value is equal to IO, the money I spend today, plus the sum of all cash coming in the future divided by the effective return rate, including inflation, for every one of those cash flows. Okay, so when the NPV, the higher it is, the more likely you will want to invest in that project. If it's zero, You may want to just zero NPV. You may want to put that money in the bank. Why? Because typically a bank or some safe investment is going to be safer than investing in a project. So unless you have a really good strategic reason for investing in that project, you may want to put your money in a bank for a zero NPV. So just to summarize one more time, what is the NPV? That's the money I outlay today for the project plus all flows of money in the future, and each flow that comes in, I'm going to divide it by the return rate, and the return rate is really the going interest rate of the day plus any inflation, and you add them up. And this IO, the outflow today, is going to be negative. All these others should be positive. Okay, so if you carefully examine this formula, this just tells you that if the flows coming in are greater than the flows going out, even when you've considered the time value of money, you're going to be in good shape. Now, there is another calculation you can do that's really based on the NPV, and this is the IRR, or the internal rate of return. Let me just tell you a simple way to do this, and we'll explore this when I'm there. And in fact, I'll send the tutor a spreadsheet to show you how to do this. But it turns out that if you if you find what interest rate produces an NPV of 0, that gives you the internal rate of return. This formula tells you the following. Unlike the NPV will give you a positive number, a 0 number, or a negative number. Positive means good. 0 means maybe. Negative means don't do it. And you're really comparing your project to a safe investment. The IRR, or the internal rate of return, tells you something different. It says, what is the effective return rate overall? Ignoring what return rates I could get on the market today, what rate will the cash flows of this project effectively return for me? And again, to look at the big picture, why are we even looking at payback period, NPV, and internal rate of return? We're doing this because we're trying to decide, should we invest in this project or not? And these are ways to help you decide that based on your company strategy for returns. And this is all about portfolio management. It's a systematic process of selecting what projects you're going to do, which ones you're not going to do, perhaps reprioritization you may do. All right, so now that you've decided to be project managers, let's take a look at what's expected of you. Now, you know what a project is, and you know company strategy is important, and company strategy should help you decide what projects to do or to not do. Well, now let's look at you and think about specific skills or behaviors you should exhibit. You will often hear that there's a difference between leaders and managers. I'm a fan of the old saying that leaders do the right things, managers do things right. So what does that mean? Well, to me, this illustrates that a leader is primarily responsible for the strategy of the company. Doing the right thing means you should have a clear understanding of what you should be doing. And that's what a leader is best at doing. Whereas a manager is very organized, is good at details, is good at executing the strategy of the leader. So you need both. You need those who can set the direction and understand what that direction is, and then others who can execute the direction. Okay, so here you see the do the right thing versus do things right. Leaders do things that are new, whereas managers maintain the status quo. Leaders innovate, managers administer or imitate, earn their position, state their position. So there's a difference between a leader and a manager, and they have their own roles in the company. So you could ask yourself, are you a project leader or are you a project manager? It depends. It depends on the nature of the project. All right? Okay, when you are a project manager, you may have heard that saying, 90% of project management is communication. Well, there's a lot of evidence for this, that you have many stakeholders, both internal and external. There's task-oriented communication and group maintenance. There's task-oriented behavior. Project managers are said to be task-oriented. And you will often hear this in management and leadership theory. task orientation versus relationship orientation? Are you focused on getting the work done, or are you focused on the relationships of your team? There should be a mix of both, but project managers are really focused on task-oriented behavior, like structuring processes, clarifying communication, summarizing, testing consensus. These are, the difficult roles of the project manager. Now, another element that project managers have to think about in the project team is scope. Remember, I said scope is about what the project is going to do. And scope, it's important to think about how you're going to control scope, because scope tends to grow. You could ask yourself, why would scope grow? If I write down what I'm going to do and then plan to do it, why would it get bigger? Well, it tends to do this because you start a project, things go wrong. When things go wrong, you have to fix it. If you try to make it better, that requires work. You must assign more people to do it, resources or funding. So scope naturally grows. Then the client may say, I wanted feature A, can you also give me feature B? And you can also get many informal requests for additional scope. So scope tends to grow like a snowball running downhill. Okay, so you need to think about clearly what you're going to do, and also think about what you're not going to do and how you're going to control that scope over time. Because, if it grows and grows, you'll never finish. Projects often begin with a statement of work, especially in a contractual project. Statement of work is a detailed description of what you're going to do. If you're a project that's created in order to produce a contractual deliverable, usually the contract will have a statement of work associated with it. Okay, you take that statement of work as an input and you create a project charter. Okay, the charter will have something about scope on the charter, and that scope will often be in the form of a scope statement. The scope statement is very brief. It gives a high-level overview of what your project is going to do, but really the charter is not so much about scope. The charter is really about authorization. Why? Because a project operates outside the normal functional organization. So it must have special authorization to acquire resources, to spend money, to do work. It needs that authorization that the normal functional organization wouldn't normally require. Okay? So your project charter is the formal authorization, gives the authority for the project manager and the team to do work. And because it's being given authority, there is going to be some clarity on what the project team is going to do. And that usually starts out simple with the scope statement. Now, the scope statement is very simple, but it's not enough to do the complete project. The scope statement is only the very beginning of outlining what your project will deliver. What comes next? Remember from Introduction to Scientific Management and Frederic Taylor, and breaking down larger work into smaller pieces? That's what the work breakdown structure does. It's a deliverable-oriented grouping of elements. It's a high-level, highly structured outline of the work that needs to be done. And this is an example of a work breakdown structure. Remember, I showed you the one from the bicycle earlier. That bicycle example illustrated all of the deliverables that the project will produce, and I'll show it again momentarily. Here it is. Here's the bicycle work breakdown structure. Remember, the scope statement could be something as simple as we're going to design a mountain bike, but the work breakdown structure details thoroughly all of the elements of scope that your project is going to deliver. And it is this work breakdown structure that's only deliverables, no activities, but once you clearly identify everything that your project will deliver, then you can start layering on top of that activities. And why is it done this way? Because the project management body of knowledge really wants you to first identify what your project will do, and then start thinking about the activities needed to be done in order to produce those deliverables. Because if you don't do it that way, there's always the danger that you're going to have activities in your project schedule that do not link specifically to deliverables. And when then that happens, you may be doing unnecessary work. So if you think of what first, what am I going to deliver, followed by who, how long, how much, that's a better way to do it, which is why you begin with the work breakdown structure, and then after you have identified scope in detail in this way, then you add activities. All right, so that's an overview of some key points of project management and the first 5 chapters. Next time we're going to get together via lecture. We're going to discuss planning, estimating, budgeting, and estimating methods. And of course, everything we discuss in these videos, we will discuss in far more detail when I'm there as well, because it's my goal that once this course is over, you will know something about project management and you will be able to actually manage projects in your place of work. So once again, welcome aboard. I'm really pleased to be working with you and visiting Vietnam again. I'll see you soon, and we'll talk to you again in the next lecture within the next couple of weeks after week 5. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.